The road was a ribbon of black between white fields, and the snow moved like breath across it, soft at first, then sharp, then a wind that seemed to push the world sideways. Headlights cut a shallow tunnel through the storm. Ryder kept his hands on the wheel because habit and muscle memory meant more here than thought. He was driving without a destination, like a man tracing the outline of a life he no longer recognized. 3 years had taught him the economy of silence. The farmhouse behind him kept lights that were polite but small. A memory warmed at the edges like the mug he left for Daniel on the counter. He saw the figure because nothing else fit the scene. A dark smear on the verge, hunched under a threadbare jacket, shoulders up around a small head. For a moment, Jackson thought it was a deer. Then the way the snow had crusted a shoulder gave him the shape of a human. He pulled off the road, boots punching into drift, and the cold reached through his coat like a threat. The man, if he could be called that, looked younger than the frost should have any business touching. Finn's teeth were a white lever in the wind. He had been at the roadside long enough for the snow to learn the angles of his face. His fingers were red and raw. When Jackson cut the engine, the world pulled close in a hush, as if the storm itself wanted to watch. "Hey," Jackson said, the words small and careful. He lifted the hood of his coat, offered his hands like the simplest tool. "You all right?" Finn turned his head. His eyes were the color of river glass, a defiant blue that had been narrowed to protect itself. He stared for a long second, as if measuring trust by the exact width of Jackson's palms. "My father left me," he said without preamble, the words slurred by cold and fatigue and a disbelief so old it had become soft. "He put me out here, said I had to learn not to be himself." Jackson thought of his own losses, of Daniel's laugh gathering dust with unused mugs and canvas frames that leaned like gravestones in the studio. He had no heroic speeches in him tonight, only a farmer's muscle memory of practical mercy. He threw a blanket over Finn's shoulders with hands that didn't shake as much as his chest did. "Come on then," he said. "Get in the truck." There were canvases stacked like sleeping people, and a paintbrush that Daniel had left with a tassel of dried blue. Finn's nose softened at the scent of oil and turpentine. For the first time in days, he felt an interior place where being quiet didn't hurt everyone else. Jackson made coffee that tasted like survival. He wrapped Finn's hands around the mug and watched the tremors settle like sediment. "What happened?" Jackson asked when words were possible again. Finn's lips moved as though he tasted that question the way others might taste salt. "My father, he found a photo on my phone of me and someone. He said I had spoiled the family name. He drove me out to the county line, said he'd come back, said he was doing me a favor." Jackson knew 100 languages of small cruelty. The life Finn described had been stitched with them. In town, folks spoke of certain families with the kind of polite reverence that hid teeth. Power didn't need a uniform. It wore a suit and paid for silence. Finn didn't say the man's name at once. Jackson learned it later, Robert Holloway, the sort of name that came with a ledger of influence and the ability to make people think the law and his wishes were the same thing. "You're warm now," Jackson said, which was both a fact and an offering. Finn pressed his palms into the mug and let heat move into him like forgiveness. Outside, the storm kept speaking in the way snow has, distant and relentless. Inside, the house held a different climate, the slow, patient heat of someone who had learned to keep a life from cracking under grief. Jackson had a way of doing things that made care look ordinary. He boiled lemon for the tea, found thick socks, nudged a robe over Finn's shoulders. In the studio, where Daniel's brushes still lay like a line of old soldiers, Jackson hesitated at the threshold, as though there might be an invocation to make before letting another man cross into their history. Finn saw the paused reverence and asked with a small, guarded curiosity, "Did he die?" Jackson's throat tightened around the truth. "Yes, 2 winters ago, heart attack. He stopped. There were details he still kept fenced with silence. Daniel had been the kind of man whose laugh filled a room. His absence had hollowed the farmhouse into a museum of small rituals they built together. Taking Finn in didn't erase that, but there was a way grief could soften into a service. "If you want to sleep in there, you can," Jackson offered at last. "The bed's warm. There's an extra quilt." Finn crawled into the spare room like a young animal finding shelter for the first time. He closed his eyes to the sound of a house breathing, and sleep came in a way he hadn't known for months, slow and trusting as a long exhaled prayer. If this story moves you, there are resources in the description for local youth support and shelters who help young people in crisis. Morning came with a hush, and the world had been fluffed and brightened into a Christmas postcard. The trees pulled neat lines under the weight of snow, and the sky kept its low, flat light. Jackson watched Finn in the kitchen, how he studied a mug like someone cataloging a new world, how his fingers left small smudges of color on the rim. Finn stepped around the farmhouse with a kind of wary gratitude, touching the worn banister as though proving it was real. He was an artist by habit, small marks, a bent thumb that had always known how to make a corner sing. Conversation began around simple things, what Finn had eaten in the past week, whether he had anyone in town he could call, whether he'd been to the shelter. The shelter had intake frozen until morning, and the sheriff's office, Sheriff Miller, had a ledger of priorities. Miller was the sort who kept both ends of the law honest. He owed more to practicality than to spectacle. He agreed to find a warm place for Finn, but the county shelter was full, and in rural stretches such things came down to options between cold and colder. Jackson's decision was immediate, though not rash. He was no savior. He was a man who owned a house with the space for another person's life to take root. He made Finn coffee and brought a paint-stained sweater for sleeves that would not swamp his shoulders. He showed him the studio with reverence, touching a canvas as though recognizing an old friend. Finn ran his fingers along a frame and then sat, sunlight coming through the window like a blessing. "I can pay you back," Finn said, and the words came out like a bargain he'd been taught. "You don't owe me anything," Jackson replied, which was true and not. Caring for someone meant buying the day's tasks into the ledger of living. It had its own currency: bowls of stew, folded laundry, the steadiness of someone standing guard when the nightmares came. Finn's confession about being outed and abandoned wasn't the first such story Jackson had heard in fragments in town, but it was the first that had settled in his kitchen and become part of the rhythm of his morning. They made a kind of truce. Finn would stay here for a while. He would help with chores. In exchange, he could use the studio. He would sleep indoors and eat at table, and Jackson would watch the Dirk for him, as men with empty rooms learn to do for others. Small things began to knit. Finn painted into the late hours, brush moving with an eagerness that looked like prayer. The studio filled with works that smelled of turpentine and courage, a portrait of the road where he'd been left, a canvas of hands reaching through snow, a small, startling self-portrait with a smudged smile. Jackson kept making tea and learning the cadence of Finn's breathing at night. When nightmares came, shouts in the dark that belonged to someone else's holler, Jackson was awake, moving without fanfare, a hand on Finn's shoulder until the tremor eased. As weeks folded into months, Finn found a rhythm beyond survival. He took classes in town when the bus schedule allowed, his sketchbook growing thick with lines. He found work in places that didn't ask for explanations, washing dishes, stacking wood, odd jobs that let him earn pocket change and the slow weight of confidence. He learned how to hang an oil painting so the light did the work for him. Jackson learned the taste of another's laughter again. It was iron and honey, and it softened the house like rain. But a town keeps memory in its own way. The Holloway name did not vanish because one of its men had thrown a son into a drift. Robert Holloway's absence, a new presence of silence, meant something else altogether. He was, in the town's practical shorthand, a man who could persuade banks and pass votes and sway small-town councils in ways that made people hedge their bets when speaking his name. The people who do business without guilt sometimes forget that other people's hearts are not ledgers. It took months for Holloway to appear in the edges of their lives. Finn first heard the name at the feed store, muttered under breath over a bag of oats. Later, a flyer advertising a foundation dinner, one of those community partnership nights where wealthy men could buy godliness, featured Holloway's photo in polished tones and a pious quote about family values. The smell of hypocrisy was a particular nutrient in small towns. It grew dense and sour. One cold afternoon, Sheriff Miller stopped by the farmhouse with coffee in a thermos and a look that had the shape of apologies practiced long. "We've had a call," he said. Finn folded his hands around the paper cup as if it were a talisman. "From my father?" "From Holloway. He says he's come to take responsibility. Wants to talk." That's the sting of the powerful. They can offer what looks like penance in the shape of theatrical returns. Jackson had learned to believe people's actions, not their press releases. The sheriff's face had the cautious expression of a man balancing public duty and private judgment. "I want to do it by the book," he said. "If there's an admission, there's paperwork. If there's coercion, we document it. You don't have to." Finn's mouth was a thin line, his jaw working with a decision Jackson knew all too well. Some part of him wanted the recognition of a name, a place in the ledger of flesh. Some part wanted to forget the ledger existed. "I want him to look at me," Finn said finally. "I want him to say my name like it matters." So Holloway returned to town with all the showmanship of a man who had never known the taste of being small. He arrived in a black car that seemed to drink the winter light, a coat furred at the collar like a stage prop. He stood at the edge of town, between the blinking fires of shop windows and a weathered sign, and Finn walked toward him as if toward a verdict. They met in the town square, at the edge of the day, under the tired gaze of an abandoned Christmas wreath. People stepped back politely. The town loved its theater, and then asked to be kept from the script's ugly bits. Holloway's face read like an account, measured, supposed to be regretful. "You shouldn't have left him," Finn said before Holloway could speak, and the words struck like a bell. Holloway's reply was a practiced thing. "I did what I thought was best," he said. "I had responsibilities." Finn had avoided him for a year, had learned to be self-sufficient and to take pride in small paychecks and the steady building of a day. But the hollow place in him that had listened for a father's name needed something more literal than a grown man's explanation. He had rehearsed humiliations in the dark and imagined 100 foolish bargains, apologies, signatures, a place at a table. Pride and something else kept clenching in his chest like a small fist. He crouched down then in the pale light and picked up a rag out of a van that someone had left open. The gesture looked absurd to anyone who measured dignity by furniture. He held the rag out like an offering. Can I clean your shoes?" Finn asked, the words smaller than he had expected, but clear against the hush. Jackson felt something break and reknit itself inside his chest at that particular posture. It was not a performance for the town. It was a private bargain made public, a child asking for a sign that he mattered enough to belong to someone. Holloway's jaw tightened. For a breath, the scene hung, small and fragile as a snowflake. Then Holloway's face changed, not in a grand apology, not with cinematic tears, but with a slackening of some old habit. "No," he said. The word arrived like a verdict, but not the one anyone expected. "No, you are my son." The line landed the way a bell does when a ship finally comes into harbor. It was recognition, plain and human, not redemption. The sound of it made the air shift. Finn's knees wobbled. He had been on the verge of humiliation, of bending himself into the shape of contrition to be loved. The admission was not an absolution of the harm done. It carried weight, an acknowledgement from a man who had tried to make his absence into a lesson. But nothing about being recognized erases the need for accountability. Sheriff Miller stepped forward then, all official postures softened by the truth of the moment. "If we're recording this," he said quietly, "we need to document the circumstances. There's an investigation into abandonment. There are support services involved. Recognition doesn't replace the need to look at what happened." Holloway's nod was small, not a surrender, but an acknowledgement that the world outside of his influence had laws, and that those laws had finally reached the threshold of his name.
The town watched with a mixture of relief and skepticism. Relief because the moment had become narrative. Skepticism because Holloway's world was one that relied on narrative as currency. Finn's shoulders bowed with a weight that was different from before. The humiliation he'd braced for evaporated. The admission did not erase the nights of cold, or the way someone's father had left him like a piece of unwanted furniture. But recognition had a power all its own. It could not take back harm, but it could begin to record it into the ledger of life. The sheriff's documentation began. Holloway was asked questions surrounded by the ordinary seriousness of people required to answer for their deeds. There were forms and recorded interviews and notes that would not become theater, but would instead become the slow machinery of justice. The town had a short memory and a long appetite for fairness. In that peculiar civic arithmetic, the man who had once expected silence now had to reckon with noise. Back at the farmhouse in the small hours, Jackson and Finn sat with mugs of tea. The house was the kind of still place that keeps secrets by folding them into the furniture. Finn's fingers smoothed the rim of his cup like a ritual. "He said it," Finn whispered. "He said I'm his." Jackson reached over and put his hand on Finn's knee. Not a healer's hand, not a possessive one, but a human touch that acknowledged the quiet triumph of living through trauma and not letting it become the whole of you. "Words can be pieces of a thing," Jackson said. "They can start the work, but the work is longer. It'll take time. There will be forms. There will be people to test what he says. We'll walk it together." Time is an institution that keeps the world honest, and months began to spool out like the patient cords of a pulley. The legal process rode at its own pace. Interviews, filings, the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that eventually becomes a kind of mercy because it means someone is watching. Holloway's admission gave the sheriff a handle, recognition that meant obligations would have to be met. There were restitution talks and court dates, and the town's whispered gossip shifted from petty curiosity into the slow machinery of responsibility. More importantly, life changed in the small, ordinary ways that mattered. Finn's art started to find audiences. Jackson signed him up for a community class. The instructor, a woman named Maureen, who taught with sharp kindness, recognized something honest in his lines and encouraged him toward a show the following spring. Finn made a painting of the farmhouse with a figure standing at the broken fence. Two people, their outlines blurred together, and its colors held the memory of a night that had nearly taken his life. Jackson returned to a house that was no longer a museum of a lost love, but a place that gathered living things. He mended the leaky porch and cleaned out the freezer. He and Finn installed a small wooden box by the side of the road where Finn had been found, a weatherproof chest with blankets, boots, and a note that read simply, "If you need this, take it." The box was not charity in the Victorian sense. It was a line cast into the current for anyone tossed aside on a life's river. The months did not heal everything. Grief and trauma altered shape but did not vanish.
Jackson still found his hand reaching for a phone that would not ring. Finn still had nights where he'd sit with the lights low and sketch the road, as if trying to map the angle of abandonment. They both learned the discipline of steady presence. Finn went to therapy, as did Jackson, not because they were broken, but because they were alive and wanted to make sense of the injuries life had made. The town, in its imperfect human way, began to change as well. A small coalition of families and neighbors pushed for more support for youth in crisis. Sheriff Miller gathered folks for a meeting at the community center, and they raised money, not for show, but for the practical costs of safe emergency housing. The Holloway name, once a talisman, now carried a different kind of air, not complete ruin of reputation, but a reminder that influence does not exempt one from consequence. Finn found a voice in the art he made and the small speeches he gave at the gallery opening that spring. He spoke about belonging in a way that didn't need the theater of a scolding or the sermonizing of adults who thought they knew him. He said simply, "Belonging is a place that says it's okay for you to exist." People clapped. Some came up afterwards with awkward apologies that smelled of soap and sincerity. Others kept their distance, which is the honesty of small-town life. Some are quick to generosity, others slow. At the gallery, under a wash of soft light, Finn unveiled the painting he had kept in progress since the winter, a portrait of Jackson and the open studio door behind him, the two figures caught in a moment of not knowing it. A small crowd gathered, and Jackson stood next to him feeling the odd, prickly joy of being recognized in someone else's work. Later, Jackson and Finn walked out into the night and toward the farmhouse. The stars were gone, clouded out by snow, which preferred the good by making sure the world kept its hush. Finn swung a small canvas bag of brochures, the coalition's leaflets, and they talked in easy halves about the supply box, about a petition they'd started to get better funding for the county shelter, about the way art could be a kind of witness. "He saved me that night," Finn said soon, and it was not the sort of declaration that wanted a reply. He had learned to name things in their proper order. "You found me in a storm." "You saved me as well," Jackson replied. The sentence was quiet. He had not expected to be rescued. Sometimes people step in to hold open a door and find they too have been waiting for some subtle light.
Once the Holloway admission had been made public, the legal consequences rippled. He faced an investigation into abandonment and into other allegations that the sheriff's office had quietly gathered. The town was not a court, but it had a memory long enough to insist on answerability. Holloway, with his wealth and name, found that the world refused to ignore the ledger of his deeds. He made restitution in the bureaucratic sense, financial arrangements, supervised visits, and community service that included talking about accountability at the very organizations he'd once thought above such concerns. There was no sentimental reconciliation where Holloway's sins evaporated in a single speech. There was, however, recognition, and the blunt necessity for the powerful to be reminded they did not get to shape others with impunity. The sheriff's paperwork became a public record. Holloway's acknowledgement that Finn belonged to him did not excuse the cruel choices he'd made. The law insisted on inquiry, on documentation. The town insisted on conversation. Finn insisted that recognition be followed by responsibility. In time, the heavy machinery of courts ground through its allotted motions. Finn's relationship with his father evolved the way plants do around a new fence, slowly, with new definitions. He accepted supervised visits because he wanted to test the man who had once left him and see if words could be bolstered by stable actions. He learned to ask for promises that had the weight of the law behind them rather than the shaky mercy of a man's mood. Jackson watched as Finn practiced the slow building of boundaries. He learned the language of asking, an art he had never been taught. He saw Finn reclaim things that had been whispered away from him, clothing choices, friends, the courage to be known without apology. Finn's sense of self, which had been frayed by rejection, grew new hems and seams. Months rolled into a year. The farmhouse adapted, the way rooms adjust when new furniture moves in. Daniel's paintbrushes remained in the studio, but now another hand had left new strokes in the frames. Finn's hands had learned to respect a place that had been full of memory and make it useful again. Finn worked at the community center teaching painting to teenagers who showed up with the same question etched into their faces: do I belong? They installed the roadside box as a small monument. The wood weathered, the lid kept the rain out. Blankets and boots were taken in the night and replaced the next day. A string of thanks notes lingered pinned inside the box,
messages from boys and girls who had used it to survive a night. The box was not a grand solution, that it was what people with 2 hands could make. There were small ceremonies of community, a winter market where Finn sold small prints of his work, and people bought them and brought home the image of a man who had been found on the road.
There was a night where Jackson, with a modest speech, announced a fund for emergency youth housing in the county. Sheriff Miller came and offered a lighter joke about paperwork and dead batteries, and people laughed with him because some humor helps hold the edges of serious things. Finn's art began to be asked for outside the county. A curator from a city gallery called. He'd seen Finn's painting in an online photo and wanted to show a selection of works from rural artists. Finn said yes with tiniest tremor of fear and a big, blooming kind of pride. He painted a series about roads. Some led home, some led away, some crossed each other like the letters of a broken promise. He gave one large piece to Jackson as a gift, a painting of the farmhouse from the road where he'd been abandoned, the porch light a warm dot. Jackson looked at its colors and felt the ache of being seen. Their relationship, Jackson's and Finn's, never conformed to old, easy categories. It wasn't parent and child, not exactly. It wasn't lovers, not in any expected way. It became something new, a found family that had the legal and social weight of chosen kinship. They argued and they made peace. They mourned and they celebrated. They were people who had been given second chances because other human beings, Sheriff Miller, neighbors, strangers who donated blankets, refused to let the story collapse into neglect. Holloway remained a figure at the periphery. He attended some meetings, spoke too loudly at others, sometimes resentful that his attempts to manage optics backfired. In therapy, Finn said the most important thing was not the sight of his father in a car, but the way the town finally chose to watch him and refused to let the memory of being left be a secret. Recognition is not a gift, he said once. It's a demand. It asks the world to witness what it did. In the spring following the trial proceedings, the town held a small ceremony by the roadside where Finn had been found. They gathered in a circle. Finn stood next to Jackson. He spoke of the nights he had learned to make himself small to survive, and the nights after, when he learned to stand without being defensive. He told the story of the rag and the shoes and Holloway's words. People listened. Some cried, because the human capacity for empathy is stubbornly present when a story is told without judgment. Sheriff Miller read a prepared statement about the importance of protecting youth. The supply box was repainted that day with bright colors, and a little plaque was screwed on that read, "For anyone who finds themselves on the roadside, you are seen." Later that evening, near the warm kitchen and under a roof that had learned to hold more than one kind of grief, Finn presented Jackson with a small canvas. He had painted Daniel into the background, like someone remembered, and Jackson in the foreground, steady and sunlit.
The painting caught 1,000 small truths. The angle of a hand, the way heat returns to a kitchen when 2 people share a task. "You didn't need to save me," Finn said, not because he argued with what had happened, but because he wanted to offer honesty. "But you did, and I needed you then. I still do." Jackson's reply was not poetry. It was simpler. "We did this for each other," he said. It wasn't rescue. It was choosing. There are moments that do not end in a tidy resolution, and this story kept its edges. The supply box needed refilling. The shelter needed funding. There were nights when Holloway's contrition looked like PR, and there were days when it was real. The law had done its part in asking the powerful to answer for the small cruelties. The community had stepped in to make sure the young did not sleep on the road. On the anniversary of the night Finn had been found, they drove out to the place where the headlights had first cut through the white. Finn left a small painted stone there, bright as a promise. Jackson stood beside him and watched the snow settle, then pressed into his hand the warm mug they'd brought, and smiled with the tiny courage of a man who had learned to live again. At the end of the day, they walked back to the farmhouse, where the lamplight made the snow look like a field of fine salt. They carried groceries inside and shared a plate of stew. Around them, the house kept its warmth, a place built on rituals of care, a living testament to the idea that family can be chosen, and that recognition, when paired with accountability, can allow something like repair to begin. If you'd like to help young people in similar situations, there are organizations and local shelters listed in the description that accept donations and volunteers. Small acts of kindness can change a life. Years later, Finn's canvases hung in places that once seemed impossible: a gallery in the city, a community center wall, a private home where a stranger had emailed him saying they had seen themselves in his work. Jackson kept a collection of Finn's studies in the studio next to Daniel's brushes, and sometimes he would stand there and watch the light catch them both, a small archive of redemption and messy, beautiful living. The town did not become perfect. The world rarely does. But there was a change so deep and practical that it outlasted headlines. More kids found a safe ride to the shelter. The sheriff's office added a line item to budget for emergency housing. The supply boxes multiplied, at the behest of neighbors who remembered what panic felt like when they had no one. Finn taught art classes where teenagers learned to paint their roads and not to become them. Jackson mended fences and hearts with equal care, and his grief learned to be company rather than a housemate who never left.
On a late winter evening, when the wind had the posture of someone who has given up on argument, Finn put his hand over Jackson's and looked at him with an easy, honest affection. "You ever regret it?" Finn asked, referring to the night he had come in out of the snow. Jackson thought of Daniel, of the ache that had once been the center of his world, and then he thought of the little things Finn did, the way he washed dishes, the tang his laughter put into the air, and he said, "No, not for a second. I was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. You changed the gravity of my days." Finn smiled and reached for a paintbrush. They sat together, two people who had found a way to be family by choice, who had watched a powerful man's words be balanced by the slow, honest machinery of accountability. The world had offered its harsh lessons, and it had offered some small kindnesses too. That was how lives mended, through practical care, collective responsibility, and the quiet rituals that let a person know they have a place at the table. In the end, the moment by the road, the rag, the shoes, the father's admission, did not signal a miraculous rewrite of years of harm. It did, however, mark the place where recognition became reality and where accountability began to be written into the record. It gave Finn something he had longed for, the knowledge that his story would be answered, not erased. It gave Jackson a purpose that stretched beyond mourning, to protect, to teach, and to love in ways that held steady. They kept the supply box filled through the storms. They kept the studio door open, the light always on in the winter, like a beacon. They kept each other, not as replacements for the past, but as witnesses for the future. Their house became a small lighthouse on a small road, enough for a life to find harbor, enough for a boy who had once been lost to know the precise warmth of being home.